Hello and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. Vote counting for this year's local elections is nearly complete. Of the 60 metropolitan mayoral and gubernatorial races, the Democratic Party is projected to win 12, with the People Power Party expected to secure 4. Meanwhile, the ruling Democratic Party continues to hold a parliamentary majority, despite conservatives making gains in by-elections. Voter turnout for this election reached 61%, the second highest on record. This appears to reflect heightened political engagement, with progressive voters mobilized following former President Yoon's martial law and impeachment, and conservative voters casting their ballots to evaluate the current Lee administration. North Korea says leader Kim Jong-un visited a newly built nuclear material production facility, and that it has finalized plans to strengthen the regime's nuclear forces. A massive number of voters across Korea headed to the polls for this election yesterday, driving voter turnout to its highest level in decades. Our Park Jun-an has the details.
Following record-high early voting turnout last week, over 27.2 million people cast their ballots in Korea's June 3rd local elections, out of approximately 44.6 million eligible voters. That brings the final voter turnout to 61%. Not only is this a 10.1 percentage point jump from the previous local elections 4 years ago, but it's also the highest turnout since the first local elections in 1995, which saw 68.4%. Progressive voters were strongly mobilized following the then-President Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law and impeachment, while conservative voters cast their ballots to evaluate the current Lee Jae-myung administration and keep the majority party in check. By region, Jeonnam Gwangju United Special City saw the highest turnout at 65.7%, followed closely by Gangwon-do Province at 64.5% and Gyeongsang-namdo Province at 64.4%. The capital Seoul was above the national average at 63.6%. However, there were issues at 14 polling stations in Seoul, including in the Songpa-gu and Gangnam-do districts, where voting was paused due to a lack of ballot papers. At least one station in Songpa-gu district remained open until 10 p.m. as officials worked to address the problem. The National Election Commission's Secretary General Ho Chul-hoon issued a public apology for the confusion and pledged measures to prevent a recurrence. In response to the issue, the Blue House urged the National Election Commission, as the constitutional body responsible for protecting citizens' voting rights, to ensure there are no disruptions to voting or vote counting in affected areas. The Blue House added that it is closely monitoring the situation. Park Jun-an, Arirang News.
And with the votes now counted, results for 16 mayor and governor races are now in. In Seoul, it was a neck-and-neck race until the DP candidate conceded just minutes ago. Our political correspondent An Sung-jin breaks down the details.
After a fierce race between political parties, Korea's local elections came to an end. The exit poll projections released on Wednesday 6 p.m. had underscored a starkly different reaction among the two major political parties, with the ruling Democratic Party erupting in applause and only a heavy silence falling over the main opposition People Power Party. This comes as of the 16 metropolitan and gubernatorial races, the DP took over 12 regions, while the PPP won 4, with the PPP's incumbent Mayor Oh Se-hoon winning over Seoul as his DP opponent conceded. Out of the key battlegrounds, Seoul came as a neck-and-neck race with less than 1% separating the candidates as the final votes are still being counted. Looking at other key battlegrounds, the DP's Jeon Jae-soo secured Busan over the PPP's incumbent Mayor Park Hyung-jun. Have a listen to his victory speech.
As mayor, I will work even harder to earn the trust and support of Busan residents for the Democratic Party to get the city moving again.
Meanwhile, the PPP secured 4 regions with both incumbent governors for Gyeongsang-namdo and Gyeongsang-bukdo provinces maintaining their holds. Daegu, which had initially projected a close result during the exit polls, also saw the conservatives maintain their grip on the city with the PPP's Chu Kyung-woo win over the DP's Kim Bu-kyung.
I believe this outcome may reflect voters' desire for Daegu to serve as a greater check and balance to counterweight the Democratic Party government.
With wins in the majority of areas, the overall outcome strengthens the ruling DP's grip on power from the national level down to local governments. For the PPP, who had campaigned on a message of holding the government accountable, defeat in many swing regions is likely to spark debate over responsibility and the party's future direction. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
And a series of by-elections that could shape the government's legislative agenda has reinforced the Democratic Party's hold on Korea's parliament, as voters largely stuck with the ruling camp. Our Moon-Yeon has the details.
Korea's ruling Democratic Party has emerged from a nationwide vote with its parliamentary majority intact, holding off a conservative challenge in a series of by-elections held across the country. The Democratic Party won 9 of 14 seats up for grabs, while the conservative People Power Party took 4 and 1 went to an independent. The results reinforce the Democratic Party's dominant position in the National Assembly, where it already holds an absolute majority. The most closely watched race was in Busan's northern Pukgu district, where Han Dong-un, a former leader of the People Power Party who ran as an independent, secured a narrow victory.
I sincerely thank the people of Pukgu for this historic victory and for helping open the door to the district's future and the rebuilding of conservatism.
Han's win is seen as significant. It keeps him in national politics and raises questions about the future of Korea's fractured conservative camp, which has been in turmoil since the short-lived declaration of martial law by former President Yoon Suk-yeol. In Incheon's Gyeongbi district, long considered a Democratic Party stronghold, the party's candidate Kim Nam-jun won comfortably.
With your support behind us, I will make sure President Lee delivers on the promises he made. I said it throughout the campaign, and I'm committed to seeing them through.
The seat had fallen vacant after President Lee Jae-myung, who had represented the constituency, won last year's presidential election. Kim, a former presidential spokesman, pledged to carry forward the president's agenda for the area, including transport infrastructure improvements. Gyeongbi has returned a Democratic Party representative in 7 of the last 8 parliamentary elections. Perhaps the most dramatic result of the night came from Pyeongtaek-bi in Gyeonggi-do Province, where People Power Party veteran Yoo Hee-dong defeated both the Democratic Party's candidate An Cho-guk, the leader of the smaller progressive Rebuilding Korea Party, in a 3-way race.
I'd like to once again express my sincere gratitude to the people of Pyeongtaek for allowing me to serve in this role.
Cho's defeat is a significant blow to his party and is expected to complicate ongoing merger talks between the Rebuilding Korea Party and the Democratic Party. Overall, the by-election results mean the Democratic Party and its allies have more than 180 seats in the 300-seat National Assembly, enough to fast-track legislation and override filibusters, ensuring the ruling party retains firm control of the legislative agenda. Moon Hye-ryun, Arirang News.
1 year after President Lee Jae-myung took office pledging pragmatic diplomacy, Korea is drawing growing attention as countries look for partners that can navigate an increasingly divided world. Our Oh Soo-young talked to a prominent scholar on Korean geopolitics.
1 year into President Lee Jae-myung's pragmatic diplomacy, there is growing demand for Korea's partnership in an increasingly divided world. That's according to Arnold Levaux, president of Paris-based Asia Center. Under the Lee administration, pragmatic diplomacy has meant pursuing national interests through practical cooperation while broadening Korea's diplomatic options in an increasingly fragmented world.
The key word is adaptation. President Lee inherited a very difficult international environment. The rivalry between the United States and China continues to intensify. Conflict in Europe, like in Ukraine and in the Middle East, Iran, and the Red Sea are affecting global stability.
Over the past year, Seoul has kept close coordination with Washington and Tokyo while expanding engagement with Europe, India, Africa, and other emerging partners. Levaux says that makes Korea valuable to countries looking for more flexible forms of cooperation.
Middle powers do not want to be forced into binary choices. They want to maintain strong alliances while preserving enough autonomy to defend their own interest. The second challenge is economic security. For decades, globalization was mostly about efficiency. Today, it's also about resilience. Many countries today are looking for alternatives to rigid bloc politics. They want flexible partnerships, focus on practical cooperation. And Korea is particularly well positioned to play this role.
President Lee made his diplomatic debut at last year's Group of Seven summit in Canada soon after taking office, and has also been invited this year to the leaders' meeting in France. With that, Laval says Korea will be expected to bring more than symbolic participation.
This invitation is not only for protocol, it's not for pictures, it's not for etiquette. It's because we believe that Korea can really contribute to the global governance. And we are expecting President Lee to have some concrete proposals. Korea is increasingly present in international debates on security, technology, and governance. I will say that the world already sees Korea as a global actor, while maybe Korea do not perceive itself as a global actor yet. So the question should be how Korea can use this growing influence.
As Lee enters his second year in office, Laval says the question is no longer only whether Korea has a seat at the table of global governance, but what it makes of it. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
And now for a closer look at this year's local election results, we're joined today by Professor Kim Soo-jin, Professor of Political Theory at Kyung University. Professor Kim, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
So voter turnout for this election was the second highest on record, right? And the results are now in. What do you make of the outcome and what stood out to you the most?
So I think there are three major points to note about this year's local election results. So perhaps the first thing to note is the dramatic shift from the local election results in the 2022 local elections, where the Conservative People Power Party won a landslide victory in most parts of South Korea. So yesterday's local election results, by contrast, were precisely the opposite. So as everybody here knows, the Democratic Party won many of the mayoral and gubernatorial races, with the People Power Party taking up just the traditionally conservative southeastern strongholds. And the second point is, of course, the last-minute takeover of Oh Se-hun in the Seoul mayoral race. So Oh had been consistently falling behind the opposing candidate Jong-un until ballots from the conservative district in the south of the Han River, Gangnam, Seocho, and Songpa, played a major role in closing the gap. So I think that's the second thing to note about this year's elections. And a third notable and perhaps disappointing fact about this year's local elections was the shortage of ballot papers, of course. And I think this sort of consistent performance of the National Election Commission is in fact, it's a very disappointing fact. And despite the shortage of ballot papers, the National Election Commission declared that there's no sufficient reason to suspend the election results. But nonetheless, it was reported that officials had prepared ballots for only 50% of eligible voters, for example, in Songpa-gu, so based on their projected turnout. And I think that this sort of lack of preparedness is, again, it's a very disappointing fact about this year's elections again.
Right. And beyond determining local leadership, what broader political implications could these election results have for the ruling and opposition parties?
Yes. So I think this widespread victory of the Democratic Party in this year's local elections shows the reinforcement of the dominant position of the ruling Democratic Party. And furthermore, I think it shows that a major proportion of the citizenry is actually in support of President Lee's administration and has strong faith in his good performance throughout the remaining years of his presidency.
I see. And this was the first national election under President Lee Jae-myung, right? Do the results suggest strong sort of public support for the administration's policy agenda, or do they point to growing challenges ahead?
So it seems that these results point to a solid public support for President Lee Jae-myung's administration, given the widespread victory of the Democratic Party in many parts of the regions, with the exception of course, the conservative southeastern strongholds. To be exact, the Democratic Party won 12 of the 16 mayoral and gubernatorial races, with the People Power Party just securing victories in only the 4 traditionally conservative strongholds. And this presents a sort of dramatic shift from the local election results in 2022. And I think it sort of reinforces our impression that, in fact, President Lee Jae-myung has a very high approval rating, and that people in general have a very good impression of his forthcoming performance in the next years ahead.
Right, and today actually marks exactly 1 year since President Lee took office. Looking back on his first year, how much progress do you think he has made in achieving promises he made on the campaign trail? And how would you assess his performance so far?
So to assess President Lee Jae-myung's presidency, I think it's probably important to first recall the promises that Lee made on his campaign trail. So the first promise that he made was to restore a healthy democracy in South Korea in the aftermath of the martial law crisis. And the other, I think, major sort of goal or promise that President Lee made is to achieve national unity and economic prosperity for everyone across different demographic groups. Now, it seems that with respect to the first goal, restoring a healthy democracy in the aftermath of the martial law crisis, I think most people would agree that, in fact, President Lee has done a very good job of securing national unity and restoring democracy and putting power back into people's hands. And then the second part about achieving economic prosperity for everyone, I think one sort of key factor that probably lies behind the high approval ratings has to do with the unprecedented surge in the Korean stock market, with a Kospi index breaking the 3,000 threshold, which was driven not least by government pushes such as the injection of extra budget and the following optimism in the economy, as well as the return and attraction of foreign investors. So I do think that there are various sorts of factors that lie behind the high positive approval rating of President Lee Jae-myung. And just to cite one of the national public opinion poll that was taken by Real Meter, it was said that Lee's performance people who had a positive outlook on President Lee's performance was approximately 58% and around 35% of disapproval ratings. Now, this seems to be much higher than President Yoon's approval ratings, but slightly lower than President Moon Jae-in's ratings. Now, it's good to note that this is a comparatively high approval rating, in particular if we also take into account the fact that the Korean Gallup poll showed that 70% of Korean citizens predicted that President Lee would perform well in the coming 5 years. So again, just to come back to full circle, there are various sorts of reasons that lie behind this positive approval of President Lee and his performance in the coming years. But one of them has to do with the thriving economy, as well as President Lee's successful efforts to restore democracy and put power back in the hands of the people after the martial law crisis.
Right. And Professor Kim, before I let you go, with the election now over, what do you think will be the main goals for President Lee Jae-myung and his administration moving forward?
So I think one of the main sort of goals that President Lee has to tackle in the coming years has to do with foreign policy, of course. I mean, the global era these days is very complicated, with wars breaking out in various parts of the world, unstable oil prices, and so on. So I think one of the hardest challenges that President Lee will have to confront is, for example, how to deal with trade talks between the United States and South Korea in a way that is sustainable for South Korea's economy in the future. So I think that's one. And then the other goal, which I think is equally important, has to do with restoring national unity and especially closing the polarization between between different demographic groups between, for example, the younger generation, the older generation, as well as between the different socioeconomic groups that currently divides the political climate of South Korea.
Right, definitely. We'll have to see how that goes. All right, Professor Kim, thank you so much for your time and insight today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me again.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has visited a newly built nuclear material production facility and said Pyongyang has finalized plans to exponentially strengthen its nuclear forces. According to the Korean Central News Agency on Thursday, Kim visited the site the previous day and claimed the North's capacity to produce weapons-grade nuclear material has more than doubled over the past 5 years under the ruling party's guidance. He praised efforts to advance the country's nuclear program and reaffirmed North Korea's determination to expand its nuclear deterrent both quantitatively and qualitatively, citing what he described as an increasingly urgent need to bolster the regime's nuclear capabilities. And following the U.S. Trade Representative's imposition of additional tariffs on 54 countries, including South Korea, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Wednesday that Seoul's regulatory treatment of American tech firms is negatively affecting trade relations. In response, the Blue House said it will respond to the USTR's 12.5% tariff by submitting written opinions and attending public hearings. It added that the government had been maintaining close communication with the United States and will make every effort to ensure that the balance of interests in existing bilateral tariff agreements is not compromised. The move comes after the USTR concluded that Seoul failed to effectively block imports of goods produced through forced labor and is considered a part of Washington's alternative trade strategy after a recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling invalidated reciprocal tariffs.
Good morning, I'm Chu Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. Lebanon and Israel have agreed to implement a ceasefire following U.S.-facilitated talks in Washington. The U.S. State Department released a joint statement from all three parties on Wednesday. The agreement requires a complete halt to Hezbollah fire and the withdrawal of all its operatives from south of the Litani River. The two sides had reached a similar ceasefire understanding last month, but fighting continued. Iran has said it will not agree to a broader deal with the United States unless the Lebanon ceasefire holds. Both sides agreed to further direct talks to resolve outstanding issues. An Iranian drone attack on Kuwait's main airport killed one person and wounded at least 60 others on Wednesday, damaging a passenger terminal that had only reopened from the war 2 days earlier. Kuwait expelled 2 Iranian diplomats and said it would neither accept nor tolerate the strikes. Iran denied responsibility, claiming the damage came from a failed U.S. interceptor, a claim U.S. military officials rejected. Washington launched retaliatory strikes on an Iranian military facility on Qeshm Island in the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. also intercepted missiles aimed at Bahrain, home to the Navy's 5th Fleet. In India, a fire tore through a mixed-use building in southern New Delhi on Wednesday, killing at least 21 people, including foreign nationals who had come to India for medical treatment. The building housed a restaurant on the ground floor and a hotel above in the densely populated Malviya Nagar neighborhood. 8 fire engines responded and more than 40 survivors were pulled to safety. Bystanders joined rescue efforts, helping carry injured people from the building as flames and smoke swept through upper floors. The cause of the fire has not been established. In Japan, a bear roaming through Fukushima on Tuesday injured 4 people across a steelworks compound in a nearby residential street. It's the latest in a series of bear attacks that have alarmed communities across northeastern Japan. Security camera footage showed the animal throwing a worker to the ground before moving deeper into the facility and injuring a second employee. An elderly woman in her 80s was later attacked nearby.
Scattered showers and thunderstorms are expected to develop nationwide, with some parts could see very heavy rain in a short amount of time. Many regions could see sudden downpours of 5 to 80 millimeters, along with thunderstorms and strong winds. Then the heat is finally cooling off a bit after several days of intense heat. But that muggy, about to rain air will feel more uncomfortable than the dry heat. And this afternoon, Seoul and Gwangju will be getting up to 28 degrees, Daegu topping out at 29 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, Gyeongsangdo provinces will be under mostly sunny skies all day. Then there is a chance that central regions might see spotty rain after midnight before skies gradually improve later in the day.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.